In this presentation, we're going to be looking at sex-linked inheritance for different organisms relating to the A-level biology specification. An easy task to get started with. All you have to decide for each statement is if it relates to monohybrid or dihybrid inheritance. Pause the presentation here, take a few moments, have a go at the questions, and we can look at the answers. So if it only involves one gene, it is monohybrid inheritance. If we're looking at two different chromosomes, then we are looking at dihybrid inheritance. If we're looking at four possible gamete combinations, if we have four possible gamete combinations, we are again looking at dihybrid inheritance. Polypeptide is linked to one characteristic. Well, one characteristic will feed back to one polypeptide, which is coming from one amino acid sequence, which is one gene. So it's monohybrid, and a 5x5 Punnett square is needed when we do a dihybrid inheritance. For monohybrid inheritance, you need a 3x3 grid. All of the chromosomes inside an organism can be split into two groups. We have the sex chromosomes, which are X and Y, and these are linked to the gender of the organism. In humans, that is per 23. In other organisms, that number is different because different organisms have different numbers of chromosomes. We also have what are called autosomal chromosomes, or autosomes. These are essentially all the non-sex chromosomes. So in humans, it's the first 22 pairs of chromosomes, because these do not in any way determine the gender of an organism. As you are aware, there has been quite a lot of debate and diversity in terms of gender identification in society. In terms of the A-level biology course, we only focus on genders male and female, and we only relate those to XX and XY chromosomes. You do need to be careful though. Don't make the assumption that every organism XX results in a female and XY results in a male. There are plenty of organisms where the reverse is true, so you do need to read those questions carefully. When it comes to your A-level exams, it is extremely unlikely that you would avoid the topic of inheritance completely. What you do need to be able to quickly identify is which type of inheritance is the question talking about. Don't just make the assumption if you see male, female, or the word sex in the question that it's a sex-linked characteristic. If the question is about a sex-linked characteristic, it must clearly show in the question the statement that the characteristic is linked to the sex chromosomes. It may say it's linked to the XX or XY chromosomes or X chromosome, but there has to be a clear link. Once we've identified that it is a sex-linked question, we then have to put down our alleles for our crosses. Just as we had with the multiple genes, and just as we had with the blood typing, weak and codominance, we can use superscript letters to identify if a allele is dominant or recessive. Normally, it's the case that the Y chromosome does not have a letter. Now, that's not to say that you won't get a question where it does, but generally speaking, it's not the case. You must make sure that if the question doesn't give you a letter for the particular characteristic, make it easy on yourself and pick a letter that the uppercase and lowercase is going to be very easy to separate out so you don't get yourself confused in any way. So avoid your C's, your O's, and other such letters, just as you would in your monohybrid and dihybrid inheritance. Let's have a look at a couple of examples of questions that might appear on the A-level exam. First one we're going to look at color blindness in humans. And for all these questions, you're going to follow the same number of steps. The first thing you have to identify is the letters that you're going to use for each of the alleles. If you look through the question says that we have color blindness as a recessive characteristic. It also doesn't give us a letter to use for that characteristic, so I'm just going to simply pick the letter N, and I'll have a capital N, which means that you will be healthy, and a lowercase n, which means that you will be colorblind. The next thing we look at is, again, as we said earlier, don't make the assumption that XX is female and XY is male. That is the case in humans, but not for every organism. We are talking about humans in this question, so we are aware that the XX does refer to female and the XY does refer to male. Once we've done that, we can identify all the possible gametes in the question. And in the question, we have an X with a capital N, we could have an X with a lowercase n, or we can have a Y. Those are the only three versions that we can have. If you're female, you'll have two X's, which can be any combination of homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or homozygous recessive. If you are male, you will only have either the dominant or recessive allele for color blindness. In the question, it says that we have a normal male, which automatically means that we have an X and a Y, and that X must be the uppercase N. The question also tells us that we have a normal female. Now, there are two possible ways we can have a normal female. We could have two X chromosomes, but the homozygous dominant for the color blindness, or we can have two X chromosomes and heterozygous for color blindness. It does actually give us an additional piece of information in the question. It does say that the female's father was colorblind. As a consequence, he must have had the X chromosome with the recessive N on it. It also means that that is the only chromosome he could pass on to his daughter, and as a consequence, the daughter had to inherit the X with the lowercase n from her father, which means that she must be heterozygous for N. So we now know what the genotype of both of the parents are. Now that we've got the genotypes of the two parents, we need to put that into a simple Punnett square. We can use the simple 3x3 as we're only looking at one gene. We just do a monohybrid inheritance style grid. Then what we do from there is we show each of the different genotypes of the potential offspring. We then clearly identify what those will actually result in terms of writing the characteristics down, so female, male, healthy, colorblind, and so forth. And then the last thing we can look at is interpretation of that. What information can we extract in terms of percentage chance of these particular people having a particular offspring with a particular combination of male, female, color blindness, and or healthy. In the original question, we weren't specifically asked for any particular outcome. We were simply asked to show all the possible combinations. So you wouldn't necessarily have to do the information that's in the black box. You would be able to stop after simply linking the phenotypes and genotypes, by saying healthy female, female colorblind, healthy male, or male and colorblind, and linking those to the relevant genotypes. But quite often in a question, it will specifically ask you for a particular phenotype combination and what the probability of that particular phenotype, for example, male and colorblind, and that would be 50% in this example. But just make sure you read back to the question to check that you've actually answered what they're asking for. The second example we're going to look at is with chickens and the speed of feather growth. The question says that male chickens have a genotype XX. As soon as you see that in any A-level question, you should immediately write down the male and female phenotypes. So you should XY is female, and in this case XX is male. If you don't do that immediately, you'll forget as you go through the question, and it'll cause you all sorts of problems later. So the second you see it, I would write it down. Some people choose to highlight it, but I've noticed that students forget, even if they highlight, to go back and pick that particular fact at first because it forms the basis of the question. So I would literally write it down somewhere else where you're going to start your answer. We're looking at a gene that controls the speed of feather growth, and we're looking at the letter F in the question, so we don't have to use our own letter. And the speed is dominant, and that results in slow feather growth. The recessive results in fast feather growth. And again, we write that down just like we've done for all the other questions. We then identify our gametes. We have the two versions of the X chromosome with the dominant and the recessive allele. And then we have, of course, the Y chromosome, which does not have an allele for feather growth on it. In the actual question, we're asked to give the genotype and phenotype of the parents, which is normally step 2. As we can't do it in this particular question, what we're expected to do is use the genotypes and phenotypes of the offspring, put that in a Punnett square, and essentially work backwards to determine the genotype and phenotype of the original parents. In the question, it identifies the offspring as 2 males with slow feather production and 2 females with fast feather production. In terms of male and female, we know the female's X and Y. So with only one X chromosome, it's much easier to determine the genotype of the female because the only chromosome we need to worry about is the X, and in this particular case, the female must have the lower recessive allele. In terms of the male, we have a little bit more of a problem because the males could be homozygous dominant or they could be heterozygous. At this point, we don't know for definite, but the easiest way to do it is to start with a Punnett square, add in the female, because we know the female genotypes have to be X and Y, and we know that if they have fast feather production, they have to have the recessive allele, so we can put those into our Punnett square. Knowing those, we can work out one allele of each of the parents. The original female parent must have given the Y chromosome, which means that the original male parent must have given each of the offspring the recessive allele. Once we know that, we can use that to then work out what the other allele on the female is. As we know one of the alleles from the male parent, we can add that into our Punnett square, knowing that the other 2 male offspring would have inherited those alleles. If we look at the phenotype of the males, it says that the male phenotype is slow. We already said that there's a homozygous dominant or heterozygous with genotype that would give us that phenotype. Well, the only way that those male offspring will have a phenotype of slow is if they have the X chromosome with the capital F of the dominant allele. As they've already picked up the recessive allele on an X chromosome from the male parent, the female parent must have an X with the dominant allele on it. That would then give the correct heterozygous combination for the males, which matches with our phenotype in the question of male and slow. Now that we've completed our Punnett square, we've clearly identified the genotype of the 2 parents. But just to make it nice and easy for the examiner to find and give us the marks, we're going to write those genotypes out again with the corresponding phenotypes. So parent 1 has 2 X chromosomes, both with the lowercase f, which is recessive, which results in a phenotype of male and fast. Parent number 2 has a genotype of Y chromosome and an X chromosome with a capital F, which is the dominant phenotype, which gives us a female and slow growing feathers. A little activity just to finish off. Can you identify the 4 main steps that you have to make sure you complete and lay out in your answer when you're looking at questions on sex-linked inheritance in order to make sure you secure all the marks? Pause the presentation now, try and come up with your answer, and then see how you get on. When answering questions on sex-linked inheritance, the 4 main steps are: number 1, to identify different alleles and gamete combinations. Step 2 is to identify your parent alleles or genotypes. In step 3, we include our genetic diagram in the form of a Punnett square. And then finally, we need to make it very clear our phenotype outcomes from whatever the question is asked and specifically to address. or if it asks just for all the outcomes, again making sure it's very clear that you've linked the genotypes and phenotypes from your genetic diagram.